A new research focus on international cultural relations in the 80s. Namely, we had a project on the Institute of Art History which focused on cultural exchange between Yugoslavia and non-aligned countries. And my focus was on the complex system that was set up on the federal level in Yugoslavia in order to facilitate international cultural exchange, and which served as the locus of inter-republic consensus building between administrative bodies, diplomats, art professionals and cultural institutions. My intention was to look at exchange with non-countries in relation to international cultural exchange activities in general, in order to have a more nuanced and complex understanding. And I think it is interesting that some of the main contemporary art institutions within Yugoslavia, who were probably the most active in proposing events for international exchange, were mostly focused on traditional art centers, such as New York, Paris, Venice, Sao Paulo, while there was only scarce interest in collaborating with non-countries. Not only this, but there are even instances in which the very status of cultural objects coming from these countries as being art is questioned. I'm not going to go too much into detail into this, but I spent most of my PhD years just thinking about data. And so on this slide you can see the approximate process that I went through in the analysis. So I want to only emphasize, I put this slide mostly here in case there will be questions about methodology or data or etc. But I want to emphasize two things. The first one is that while I was originally more narrowly interested in the social circle that was invested in internet and new media art, which is here represented by the first journal, Arzin, which you probably know, a periodical that started off as a fanzine of the anti-war campaign. As I was progressing with research, I concluded that to have a more thorough understanding of the changes that were happening, it was necessary to broaden the scope of actors in the analysis. This meant for me back then that I didn't want to shy away from the nationalist interventions in the culture sector of the newly elected Croatian government, because I thought it was necessary to have a more detailed understanding of both their activities and the discourses that follow them. And this is why I included the second and third periodical, Kontura and Vienac, both of which still exist today, and one of which, Kontura, from the very beginning showed ambition in developing the art market proper in Croatia and was connected to an auction house, while the other, Vienac, the third one, was published by an institution that was originally founded in the period of the Croatian national revival in the 19th century, and it is still today concerned with the protection of all things Croatian, you know. And so, although this didn't turn out quite as I hoped, it did provide me with a greater variety of cultural actors, and so I'm highlighting this just so you bear in mind that, you know, within my dataset you can also find like traditional salon exhibitions, etc. Also participation in large-scale international exhibitions such as the Documenta, Venice Biennial, etc. And so the second thing I want to emphasize is that today I will show you networks that I constructed afterwards, which are institutional collaborative networks, and I constructed them when I was dealing with the influence of Soros Foundation organizations on the structure of the local visual art scene. And the networks in question are one mode, which means that it's only institutions, and the logic behind the data is if two institutions were mentioned in the same piece of art criticism, this means that they collaborated in the organization of the same art event. I will focus only on Central East European institutions other than Croatia, although it has to be stressed that both the structures and narratives about them are always in some way connected to what was happening locally, and speak as much about the aspirations of local cultural workers as they do about other institutions. So it can be claimed that if we consider the entire global art world as one integral network, the network visualizations that I will show you offer a spatially determined glimpse of its structures, while the narratives speak about the meanings that the local cultural workers attributed to these structures or to the events that were organized within. So, So I divided the documented collaboration between years 94 and 2006 into two periods so that we can see the changing dynamic of these structures. So in the first one, until 1998, the percentage of institutions in Croatia is a little over 50%. Other CE institutions make up around 10% of the network, and out of these 10%, institutions located in Slovenia demonstrate considerable dominance percentage-wise. Structurally, the most interesting part for the analysis is this, the giant component in the middle, the largest connected component of nodes, where we can see that in terms of collaborative practices, only a couple of institutions connected the local art scene to the international art world. While in the periphery of the network we find isolated collaborations and events in geographies. No, let me check, something happened. Okay. While in the periphery of the network, we find isolated collaborations and events in geography that were followed and deemed important by local art critics, but that had no collaborative ties with local institutions. Out of these, the bigger components include events organized by institutions based in USA, UK, Prague, Maribor in Slovenia, and the Netherlands. So, next one. If we focus on the influence of individual nodes, international nodes within the giant component, the two most powerful ones, according to Between centrality, are the Moderna Galleria in Ljubljana, the Venice Biennial, Kapelica Gallery in Ljubljana, and Documenta. And that even though here there are instances of collaboration with institutions located in Poland, Hungary, Bulgaria, Bosnia and Herzegovina, the focus was mostly on big representational formats and on the Slovenian institutional landscape, which often also acted as a bridge toward other geographies for local institutions. So what does this all mean? If we switch to narratives, as is known, one of the dominant narratives concerning Central East European cultural actors in the 90s was, of course, the rapprochement between East and West, the disappearance of supposed boundaries between them. It is also known that one of the mechanisms for this was the organization of large-scale international exhibitions that featured artists from the region. And on this slide, I put a list of exhibitions, such exhibitions that featured more prominently within Croatian art criticism, which includes, of course, some that were organized within the region. So the exhibition Cartographers that was organized by the Museum of Contemporary Art in Zagreb and later traveled to Warsaw, Maribor and Budapest, can be seen as an effort by Croatian cultural actors to join the circuit, to put Zagreb on the map, so to say, of relevant international art events. I wanted to I was hoping I would have pictures of the event for this event, because supposedly in the opening there was, which was glamorous as described in the criticism, there was like a big cake, big fruity cake in the shape of Europe, and that each participant in the opening could get a piece of Europe, you know. So the narrative that followed such events was first and foremost an explanation of the fact that Eastern Europe was always already Europe. Hence, these kinds of exhibitions were seen either as a temporary phase, which will necessarily end with the full integration of Eastern European art into the mainstream of European heritage, or later on in the decade, it was also often interpreted as a smart strategy of regional cultural institutions to enter global cultural communication and assert themselves as artistic centers within the new political geography of the world. So from a local perspective, the position of the regional capital of culture was attributed to Budapest, of course, which was described as being mindful of the right timing in the organization of events and introduction of some topics, as having an ear for shifts within the art sector, and as constantly showcasing that the specificity of the region is the diversity of artistic practices, which were, more importantly, always happening simultaneously to developments in Western Europe. Because of local cultural dynamics, it is always stressed that such initiatives in Budapest were always supported even by the government. So the importance attributed to Budapest presents a slight divergence from what we could see from in the network data, contrary to the position of Ljubljana and Slovenia more generally, which feature prominently no matter which way we approach the analysis. The art scene in Ljubljana is followed extensively. It is described as lively, pioneering, agile, and Europeanly strong. However, it is not uncommon for events happening in Ljubljana to be interpreted more critically, most probably because of the shared past, where the success of Slovenian institutions and artists internationally is sometimes described as a byproduct of knowing how to play the game. So we could say that international participation and recognition is more generally interpreted as proof of an artist's or institution's worth, even sometimes as proof of the national worth of an artist. And international participation provides opportunities for competition, rivalry between local artists and internationally acclaimed ones. So for me, another interesting aspect of these narratives is that it also often includes assessments of possibilities of artistic production during socialism. The art system during socialism is often described as an artistic and cultural ghetto, in which artistic liberties were waded in with the communist boot, and in which European values were constantly destroyed and denied. Artistic production was necessarily polluted with politics in socialism, while the negative attitude of socialist elites toward contemporary art is supported by the fact that there are almost no museums of contemporary art in Eastern Europe. So this is especially interesting to me because, as we know, alternative artistic practices during socialism were locally organized from within the socio-political system, and in my opinion they speak of a long-term orientation of local contemporary art institutions towards traditional European centers, whereas certain aspects of Yugoslav foreign cultural policy were in both periods interpreted as an imposition toward natural developments of contemporary artistic practice. I highlighted in the second one such an opinion about where one art critic says that the communists, they threw us into the darkness and horror of the third world in which the previous communist regime has so zealously pushed us for half a century. So if we switch to the next period, the percentage of institutions located in territories other than Croatia and in Central Europe remains roughly the same, while the one of Croatian institutions lowers in favor of CEE institutions. However, it has to be stressed that this network is twice the size of the previous one, meaning that in terms of absolute numbers, all three categories demonstrate growth. A wider range of CEE countries are present within the network, as you can see, although Slovenian ones still dominate. Focusing on the relation between the giant component and the periphery, we can conclude that a greater number of local actors participates in international collaborative activities, even though we still find isolated collaborative events. It seems that there are almost no territories in which events are extensively followed, but from which local cultural institutions are excluded. So, when we focus on the giant component, the possibility of information flow within the network is more even and the collaborative practices are more distributed. However, when looking at the most powerful international nodes according to different centralities, it becomes clear that the position formerly belonging to Slovenian institutions is taken over by the ones based in Vienna and Graz, which serve as a bridge toward institutions in USA, UK and some in Germany. Moderna Galleria in Ljubljana, as you can see, still features prominently, but it is more firmly integrated into international clusters, finding itself in the same network community as, for example, Documenta. In general, most of the CEE institutions present in the giant component are located in ex-Yugoslav republics, meaning that there were more consistent efforts to re-establish connections that were severed in the beginning of the 90s, while most of the other CE institutions have a more passive role in collaborative networks. There are some exceptions to this, most notably the solar centers, which feature more prominently in this period than in the 90s, or Slovak institutions specialized in photography, which had firm ties with local Croatian institutions that were also like specialized for photography. So I'm reaching sort of like the conclusions, well, the narratives of the period after 98. Before I kind of like start with this, I have to say that after the completion of my PhD, I sort of decided not to undertake any more extensive historical examinations of the period after the year 2000. And following this, I will only give a rough and vague assessment of the narratives that follow these structures after the year 2000. In general, it has to be said that there is no narrative that dominates art criticism in the same way that spatial European belonging was in the 90s. One of the reasons for this is the fact that already around 1998 in the local art scene, we see a greater diversification and separation of different aesthetics and ideological circles. On the one hand, new generations are entering the scene and bringing with them new discourses, while on the other, the changed political differences locally and the end of the war in Croatia also played their part in this. Namely, nationalist interventions into the cultural sector in the 90s functioned as sort of a loose, cohesive mechanism between diverse cultural actors. So the Eastern European narrative that was really dominant in the 90s still persists for a couple of years, but only within specific social circles, and is very soon replaced by a narrative about the Balkans, which is connected, of course, to the Austrian institutions, but not only. And as we could already see from the network data, the focus was first and foremost on re-establishing relations between ex-Yugoslav countries, and in that sense, Slovenia and especially Ljubljana remain extremely important for local art criticism. So I'm going to show you just one example of the narratives that follow this, and I am showing this one because it speaks well both to what was and what is to come. So it is representative of the way Slovenia and Ljubljana were written about during the 1990s, where it is emphasized how, contrary to Croatia, the Slovenian government, institutions and individual cultural actors are doing a lot to introduce Slovenian art to the international art world, among other things by inviting well-known foreign curators, which will later go on to curate important exhibitions, such as Documenta in this case, and which will surely ensure invitations to Slovenian artists to such exhibitions. One other thing that I find interesting, but this is mostly probably local, when they're discussing exhibitions held in Ljubljana, they always are super careful where the Croatian artists are placed within the exhibition space, especially when it comes to the graphic biennial in Ljubljana, because they always mention it is known who gets placed in the basement, which was in the 80s, of course, the NAM countries. So here they are, of course, satisfied with the placement of Mladen Stilinovic. So this changes a little bit by the end of the 2006 with the questioning and re-evaluation of certain aspects of formerly socialist societies. Now, what is to come is a little bit more difficult to determine clearly, mostly because there are a lot of contradictory accounts. But we could say that there is in general more talk about the working conditions of cultural workers. However, the situation is described as being in between. The socialist infrastructure is destroyed and we are still waiting for the art market to develop. However, I find that the system itself is never really questioned. It's possible to find accounts where the art market is critically described, but only the art market proper, whereas the activities that contribute to the artists or the institution's symbolic capital are never really seen as part of this process, but they are accepted as integral parts of the system to which they belong. Not only are the mechanisms of selection, competition, rivalry and success not questioned, but there are accounts, for example, in which private collectors are described as heroic figures that are taking care of the artists, especially if they are collecting what was called unmarketable art. or accounts in which organizing quality international cultural programs with little to no remuneration is actually seen as a value. On the other hand, going through this material, it is possible to discern that a lot of artists actually were producing artwork that questioned their position within the system or the system itself. However, in art criticism, this was presented as a collection of individual stories and not as a systemic class issue.